So, guys, this episode is a couple of months in the making, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. If you guys haven't yet, find out the news that a 10,000-year-old species has just come back to life. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if you guys haven't heard the news, the dire wolf is back from extinction. Now, this has brought a whole bunch of controversy along the way, especially as far as hunting is concerned. We're going to deep dive into that in this episode, not particularly on this topic, but something a little bit more relatable. And that is, what are the indigenous species to each province in Southern Africa? Now, this was an interesting one for me, and it took me a couple of months to really get the grasp and the figures and try and figure out everything. The sources I have are going to be down in the description. There's more than, I think, there's over 60 different sources that I have used, and I've compiled the best possible list I can find, from conversations to books and just basic resources on the internet. So I would love to know what you guys think of this week's episode of the podcast. And without further ado, let's get into it. So, guys, just for a disclaimer, I've got my laptop in front of me. Like I said, this episode has been one that I've tiptoed around a little bit because I wanted to try and get as many facts as I possibly can. But to be completely honest with you guys, unfortunately, I haven't got a definitive answer. While there's so many different perspectives and perceptions about our hunting industry out there, because it's so new, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But some people might have been saying that the greater kudu migrated south, and now we find in some parts of the Eastern Cape with some greater kudu genetics, and thanks to game farming, there's a whole bunch of different species introduced into every single different province. But that wasn't the question I was asked. A couple of episodes ago, I did a podcast on not genetics, but the color variance and the color variant phases as far as the South African species is concerned. Black impala, golden wildebeest, all these sort of things. But one of the questions that were brought to light for me, and it was somebody that had traveled around South Africa. Now, those of you that have and been very fortunate to go to some of our national parks, a lot of the questions get asked in those national parks is that why are there only so few number of species? Now, it's an interesting one because, for instance, in the Addo, there's an abundance of kudu, warthog, impala, red hartebeest, and all these sort of species. It's indigenous to that part of the country. Well, essentially believed indigenous. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, as we get into this podcast, you guys will see that there's a couple of species that even surprised me of not being indigenous to certain parts of South Africa. I'm a little bit amazed, to say the least, that from the resources I've gathered, a lot of this has definitely left me, when I compiled this episode, it left me asking more questions and getting answers out of it. So I would love to hear what you guys anticipate from this episode and what have you taken away from it. Some of the points are going to be correct in your guys' eyes and some of them aren't. Some people might have very good arguments why certain species don't originate from certain parts of South Africa, and others might agree with me. So this episode was purely designed on opening that conversation and opening that platform around the campfires and having different conversations. Essentially, that's what PH Journals was all about. But I've wanted to deep dive a little bit more into that. So I think a great starting point is for me to really put in a nutshell on how this all came about. So if I get you, sorry, I'll just, guys, it might sound like I'm very disruptive and disconnected because while I'm scrolling through my laptop, I try to script things as much as I possibly can. I'm not one for scripts, but I just felt that having as much knowledge and basis as I possibly can in front of me might just essentially help me get through this episode because there's a lot of intricate details that needs to be mentioned. So, for instance, if we start off with saying that game farming is relatively new, what do I mean by this? Well, those of you that know and have followed the South African hunting history very closely, you guys would have understood a couple of the species were near extinction. For instance, the black wildebeest, even the Cape buffalo in some parts of South Africa, the oribi, the southern oribi, um, these numbers dwindled immensely from poaching, land encroachment, overpopulation. A lot of the resources that I read and that I had come across actually blamed hunting. Now, one of the key factors I want to mention, and it's just going to be a pure mention at the end of this episode, is all about the Cape lion. Now, the Cape lion originated in the Cape provinces, Eastern Cape and Western Capes more predominantly. Now, this lion was a massive species. Now, the last recorded evidence of this lion was up in 1858, where officially the last lion was actually hunted. Now, the reason for these animals to get to the size they were was the massive amounts of large game in the area. Now, if you can imagine a couple of centuries ago, the vast Karoo plains filled with herds of buffalo and eland, documented not only by hunters but also by the Bushman paintings in those areas. And if you can imagine these animals living off the sweet, rich Karoo veld, building their bodies up to these massive conditions, it needed a predator to keep the numbers down. And that was the Cape lion. And the reason for the Cape lion's size and genetically far superior than any other lion on the African continent was purely because it was hunting these large animals. And if you do deep dive into the Bushman side of things, and I would love to have Stephen Townley Bassett on this on one of my next episodes. If you guys haven't yet, it's one of my very first episodes I recorded. He documents a lot of Bushman paintings in the Eastern Cape and the Cape area. Have depicted sightings of these massive animals taking down large numbers of herds. Now, what I say large number of herds, well, the Cape lion was extremely sociable. So they were building up prides of up to 40 lions at a time. Now, to feed these large animals, they had the best possible resources. So, why am I mentioning all of this? Well, we're going to get into it. So, when the colonial farmers, colonial settlers, the Great Trek, the Afrikaners, the Xhosas, the Zulus, everyone migrated to South Africa, a lot of the ecosystems were disrupted. And they had to make way. Hence, while the black wildebeest almost was driven to brink of extinction, there were just a mere minimal amount of numbers. I actually don't have those numbers with me at the moment, but I think I have mentioned them in a couple of my previous podcasts. And now they are a thriving resource. Why was that? Well, at the time, colonial farmers, the Boer, the Xhosas, the Zulu, the people that had lands, anything that competed for their land was pretty much eradicated because they didn't have any sort of value to them. More specifically, the Cape buffalo. The Cape buffalo was an intense species, a very dangerous species, and that's why they drove them near to extinction. Now, from some of the reports I read about the Cape lion were physically hunted out of extinction on purpose, purely because they had stopped feasting their eyes on the Cape buffalo and finding a little bit more of an easier prey, being the cattle and the sheep stocks and all that sort of stuff that were driving through that area from the settlers. So deliberately taken out. Hence why There's still some parts of genetics found in the lions in South Africa today because a lot of the lions either migrated or actually were shot out. And the ones that migrated a little bit north have a very slight chance of breeding into new prides, and that's why the genetics carried on. Anyway, I've gone a little bit on a tangent, but I thought that was just some really interesting information that I picked up from a couple of the articles I had read. But to put everything into a nutshell, a lot of the farmers and the wildlife conservationists back in the 1960s believed that game was going to be seen as a valuable commodity, pretty much how we see it today, thanks to the hunting dollar. However, back then, there was no such thing as the hunting dollar. However, photography safaris became a lot more popular. Okay. Now, that's important to understand because thanks to our national parks and the surrounding abundance of wildlife that naturally occur in these areas, people understood that there was a value now to our species of animals. This is a key moment in South African history and essentially where the word game farming comes from. Now, a lot of the US based people call it ranching. And I'm not quite sure where that originates from, but we don't do it this side. It's called farming. So, how did this all come about? Well, back in 1991, South Africa passed a law that you could privately own wildlife now. And that is when the boom started. So if you could own wildlife, you could essentially do whatever you want to it. Now, with the rich history South Africa has in hunting, people saw this as a massive opportunity. Hence, why they started putting up, instead of stock fences, they put up half fences and they bred their numbers up on their property to a reasonable amount. And this is the true meaning of conservation. Yes, have we manipulated the ecosystems? 100%. But it's hard to believe that if we didn't do this radical transformation or put systems in place for us to own wildlife, we might have a very different South Africa today. At the time, South Africa was growing at a rapid rate. We were just about to come out of apartheid. The investment opportunities into the South African continent or into the South African country was massive at the time, and the boom really started taking off. So you can only imagine that large investments, large populations all over the country, we might see a very, very different country to what we have today. But thanks to the smart people that were running the show at the time and put systems in place to understand that land is probably going to be one of our most important conservation efforts, and then to our wildlife. So, like I mentioned, just some of the key success stories of this whole episode, of course, was the Cape buffalo. Like I said, there were just a couple of hundred left in the area. And now, thanks to careful game farming and careful game breeding, we have seen the numbers rise to more than 20,000 Cape buffalo in South Africa today. And that is absolutely outstanding. I'm about to do a podcast with a great gentleman called Jeff Ford. He's done exceptional work down in the Port Alfred area with bringing back the Orobi numbers. And that is all just purely thanks to the hunting dollar. But now, with this, there are always some controversies. So we've manipulated ecosystems. Rare subspecies have been altered, essentially. And ethical lines have been broken, especially with the color barrier type of move. But anyway, with that being said, let's dive into the list of animals that I have come across that are actually indigenous to certain parts of the country. Now, for those of you that have never been to South Africa before, South Africa is divided into how many? I think it's 8 provinces, 9 provinces. Sorry, chief. My geography teacher is not going to be happy with me about that. So essentially, it's been divided into these 9 provinces. And prior to all of this, we had migrations in South Africa. Some people have gone on to document the Drakensberg eland. The eland used to migrate across the Drakensberg mountain range, actually chasing fresh vegetation along these mountainous ranges. And also the Tetebi. Now, for me, I didn't believe that the Tetebi actually was, I didn't think it was indigenous into South Africa. I thought it came from parts of Namibia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, that area. But surprisingly not, more north of South Africa, the Tetebi used to do a massive migration from the Northern Cape into parts of Mpumalanga and Limpopo, recorded. And this is where the gray line gets blurred even more, because a lot of individuals, especially on some of the articles I've read, believe that certain species actually originated from those countries. And if you look at the breeding patterns and if you look at the migration patterns, no one can really put a finger on it. Yes, there are certain species that you can actually for sure say that they come from that area because they're not migrating animals. However, the large number of herd species that are mentioned in this list probably don't really originate from these provinces. However, having migrated across these vast different plains and landscapes have subsequently meant that, yes, they are part of certain provinces to date. But it was very interesting to me. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to do an episode like this was to really understand the impact game farming has had on our industry. And I'm saying that, and I'm going to be I mention it with the utmost respect because I personally believe that introducing new species into, let's call them hunting areas and not game farms, but hunting areas, has been a blessing in disguise. I think we've rescued, yes, we may have altered ecosystems and we may have altered um, migration patterns and animal behaviors and all that sort of stuff that have popped up in the arguments. But in essence, in the bigger picture, we've rescued a species from the brink of extinction. Now, one of the questions were asked to me about this whole direwolf thing, and we got into conversation about it, was that when specific species were extinct, it meant that something had to give way for these animals to either die off. We're not talking about catastrophic activities like a meteorite or anything like that, and like the Cape lion. But we're talking about bringing a species back that has been extinct for more than 10,000 years. What has the biodiversity, what has the ecosystem delivered on to this point that makes us as human beings think that these animals now can survive in a new habitat? Joe Rogan said something very interesting on his podcast the other day, and it made perfect sense to me because I've always been one for reintroduction of species into a natural habitat that they were essentially known to be in. I've always been an advocate for it to be, well, why aren't you introducing these wolves into Yellowstone? Well, things have changed since then. Movement has changed. The animals that are inside Yellowstone aren't aware of predators anymore. So they're stupid. They will be like, if an elk sees a wolf come running past, he's like, well, that's a strange looking dog, and stand still. And that's easy pickings for a highly intelligent predator that's looking for its next meal. So he made a perfect point in that. And this just goes to say again, human intervention when it comes to things like that, and especially now bringing this extinct species back, it does ask a lot of questions. It raises a lot of eyebrows, and I can completely understand why it would do that. But for some of us, myself included, it's kind of cool. It really is kind of cool because I believe it's just another form of conservation, because if a species was going to be, let's call the black wildebeest. The black wildebeest was driven to near extinction because land encroachment, right? The black wildebeest, some of the reports I've read, and a majority of the reports I read, is that the black wildebeest damaged land, and they're very hard on the veld. They damaged land, and hence why farmers decided to eradicate them, because they weren't bringing any value to them. They had no value, right? They couldn't shoot them for meat. It was very difficult to take photos of them because they were running around like clowns at the bush, excuse the pun. Um, but also, they damaged valuable grazing lands. So the farmers and hunters alike drove them to near extinction, right? There's a reason for that. There's a reason that those species didn't have a place in the food chain anymore. However, conservationists have essentially taken those animals and nurtured them someplace else and helped them to adapt to the new environment and bred their numbers up. And I'm just talking from my point of view. And I know we never had humans around back then, but if nature couldn't do it, then are we why are we so hard on ourselves to bring these species back? Because maybe we can have the opportunity of bringing these species back, not just for the good of visual appreciation, but also for the good of understanding better biodiversities, what they were like back 10,000 years ago. And how do we do that? Through animal behavior, through genetics, and all that's understanding animal genetics and DNA from a species born all that time ago. So again, I've gone on a little bit of a tangent. I apologize. I'm very excited about this episode. We're already 21 minutes in and I haven't even mentioned the first list. So let's just get into it. So from province, the Limpopo province, of course. So these are the indigenous species. What I've compiled from the amount of resources I've had, um, that they're indigenous to. So Limpopo, the Greater Kudu, the Southern Impala, Nyala, Bushbuck, Sharpsgraceback, and Zetebe. So there's 2 points that I need to mention in this. The Zetebe was more prominent in the northern parts of Limpopo. Uh, Same too with the Sharpsgraceback. Bushback is the Limpopo bushback, far different in color variance compared to what the Cape bushback is. And now they're in Nyala. So for the better part of South Africa, Inyala were understood that they were predominantly found in KwaZulu-Natal. However, according to some of the reports, there were very few sightings of Inyala in the Limpopo region, hence why they've put it on the list. And then, of course, we've got the Greater Kudu. In Mpumalanga, we had the common rebuck, the grey darker, the mountain rebuck, and Oribi. There's mention now the Oribi and the Sharpsgraceback in very limited areas in Mpumalanga. It was a high traffic zone. So what I picked up from a lot of the articles, it was a massively high trafficked zone for illegal immigrants into the country. Hence why a lot of the population of not easy, but vulnerable species were taken off thanks to human, or driven a little bit far north in the highlands and stuff. So mountain rebuck more commonly found in the highland areas. Then we get down to Gauteng. Historically home is the grey darker steenbok and springbok. More in the southern parts you found the springbok. Um, a lot of the species in Gauteng, from what I understand, is that back in the day before the big city lights and all that sort of stuff, it was just massive vast areas of grasslands. So the springbok, the steenbok, they thrived in those areas. There were also sightings from the southern parts of Gauteng, the blesbok migrating into that area. Northwest, of course, we have springbok, more in the western parts. The Tetebi, they were in selected areas. Now, this is where that migration comes from the Northern Cape across. Now, whether they were even indigenous into South Africa, I always believed that Tetebi were not indigenous to South Africa. However, doing a little bit of research, it really opened my eyes to how much of the species I didn't know came from here. Um, actually didn't. So it was, yeah, mind blowing to say the least. So it's said to be in very few selected areas. And then the red hartebeest, surprisingly, comes from Northwest. Free State, of course, world renowned for its incredible springbok, the trekbok, as they used to know them, as they used to name them during the Great Trek. Blesbok came from the area. Black wildebeest, like I said, this was the area where high crop farming was being done. So too with cattle farming, and the black wildebeest obviously clashed with a lot of farmers in that area. In the southern parts of the Free State, you found the mountain reback. Now, the Northern Cape, this is one of the very few provinces I really would love to hunt, and for two reasons. And they're the two on the list that I'm going to mention first: the springbok and gemsbok. So, the springbok, we call them the Kalahari springbok. They're not the trekbok springbok that we know down here in the Eastern Cape and the Free State. So the Kalahari springbok are the jewels of the Karoo, and the jewels of the sorry, no, not the Karoo, the jewels of the Northern Cape. They these massive springbok, getting 15, 16, 17-inch springbok. Beautiful animals. They really are something special in the Northern Cape. And of course, the most iconic desert antelope has to be the gemsbok. And it's just a true Kalahari experience, hunting the gemsie up in the Northern Cape. And yeah, that's very, very high up on my bucket list. Steenbok, darker. And this was an interesting one for me. Reports have had it. Now, I don't know if the guys that have smuggled these species in have what would you say, dummied or fooled the conservationists, and highlighted that the roan antelope are indigenous to the Northern Cape. Now, this surprised me. However, I will, for a good reason, put the articles. I mean, of course, all my references are going to be down in the description. Without my description looking like a Christmas tree, I would really like you guys to go along and read some of those articles that I found. The roan was a very, very interesting one for me. There was a lot of mixed feelings about this, and some people say that they were just brought across the border from neighboring countries. Some people say that they naturally migrated into the Northern Cape. However, on very rare occasions, you would see the roan, and yeah, it's debatable. I don't know. I'm in a mixed opinion about that. So in the Western Cape, we have the grey rhebok, which is better known as the fall rhebok, Cape Graceback, bontebok. Bontebok was also one of the most epic South Africa conservation stories. Nowadays, it's very, very rare. I don't even think that, I think they haven't even opened them up uh, um, to uh, to export them. I must double check that. I know they recently hadn't opened them up. You need blood tests. There's a whole bunch of rigmarole that game farmers have to go through to have these species on their land, and yeah, but roughly so, because they can easily be crossbred with Blesbok. Actually, on my previous YouTube episode where I hunted the Blesbok with my bow, you could definitely see massive, strong genetics of a bontebok in that Blesbok herd. So yeah, just over time, the crossbreeding breed of these species has happened. And it's really cool to see how nature conservation, together with US Fish and Wildlife, have compiled ways to make sure that our game farmers, if they want to keep these species on their property, have to go by certain criteria to make sure that they have a strong and healthy herd. And more down on the garden route side from George, Mossel Bay, that area, you can find the Cape Bushback. And then my home province, sorry, I do want to mention, sorry guys, I forgot to, I had them as a little side notes over here. So the Free State was home also to the Birchall zebra, and the Western Cape, obviously, to the Cape Mountain zebra, very well known. Also the Cape leopard. Now, I'll chat a little bit about the carnivores. I actually did a podcast on the strawberry leopard a couple of episodes ago. So if you guys haven't yet, go along and check that episode out. Very, very interesting one. They recently found the strawberry leopard in parts of the Knysna forest. Now the strawberry leopard is probably just a color variant of the Cape leopard, much smaller cat. Yeah, but again, I had so many mixed opinions and mixed feelings on that. It was a little bit, yeah. Anyway, is what it is. Back home, of course, we've got the Cape Bushback, Common Darker, the Fall Roebuck, Mountain Rebuck, Cape Gracebuck, the Oribi, Eland, and the Cape Mountain Zebra, as well as the Red Hartebeest and reportedly the blue wildebeest. Debatable, but it is there. Yeah. And then, of course, the Eastern Cape is known for the warthogs, so too are many of these other provinces. Warthog were probably on, I want to say 90%. I think the only place I didn't pick up warthog was the Western Cape. Yeah, but warthog probably throughout most of even the African continent. Okay, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. Of course, their flagship animal was the nyala. Sorry, I missed one. Yeah, on the Eastern Cape, blue darker was another one. That was blue darker, common darker. I did mention common darker. Blue darker was on here as well. So KwaZulu-Natal, nyala, red darker, blue darker, common rebuck, oribi, and bushback. And Sunni. Sorry, I missed it. The common rebuck was an interesting one. Apparently, they migrated down from Mozambique. However, a lot of them believe that they were indigenous to the area, which is pretty cool. I love common rebuck. I think they're really cool animals. Now, this is where it gets tricky. There were sightings in the earlier days before the Kruger Park was essentially a massive national park, that there were glimpses of crocodile down in Natal. I've hunted crocodile on a game, not a game farm, on a natural farm, cattle farm, where we hunt red darker. We got permits to hunt them there. We found hippo there in the Shishiwi area. So all these species have been renowned to be across the whole of South Africa. Now, crocodiles 10 to 1 that you find them up in Limpopo, in the more warmer provinces of the Southern Africa. Hippo, likewise, they've got thick, blubbery skin. So, I mean, a lot of them have been indigenous down here in the Eastern Cape, Western Cape have been found. So they've been scattered all over. And, yeah, giraffe as well. So giraffe have been found pretty much everywhere you can find an acacia tree. Has been a rich population of giraffe. Again, I think the only province that never had a recording more north of that province, almost into the Northern Cape, was the Western Cape of giraffe. But it was just, for me, amazing to see the indigenous species that I had no idea that, for instance, like the Northern Cape, still, it's a flip of a coin for me. I'm not 100% sure. I wasn't convinced by any of the articles that I read. So I've left two very popular species off the list. And one of them is the Cape buffalo. I mentioned it when I went on that little rant about the Cape lion. The Cape buffalo, of course, originated from the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and parts of Natal. Now, a lot of people have had this opinion about subspecies. Now, for me, it's very difficult to call something a subspecies if they've housed very close characteristics, looks, and more importantly, genetics. So, a lot of people say that the buffalo that were found in the Mozambique and northern parts of South Africa were not legitimate buffalo, Cape buffalo, and they were more like a swamp buffalo. There's so many different variants. You can distinguish between the two. But I think with the game farming now, it's kind of mixed the DNA and mixed the genetics up as much as it possibly can. Excuse me. And hence why we've come to these crossroads and saying, okay, well, maybe they weren't just found in the Eastern Cape and you could find them in other parts of Africa. But for now, I know of the three provinces, Western, Eastern, and Natal. And then, of course, the lechwe. Now, the lechwe are not indigenous to South Africa at all. They come from the wetlands areas from Zambia, Botswana, Angola, um, uh, Tanzania, those areas there. And so they were also just brought into this beautiful country. They've made it home. Like I said, they swamp bearing animals, but yet we've got massive populations of them up out here on the outskirts of Queenstown in the Pennock Pass area where it gets below freezing every single winter. So they've really adapted very, very well. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is what has this had on our ecosystem? Bringing these foreign species in, and I'm not just talking about the raised lechwe, I'm talking about swapping between provinces on some of the species I've mentioned in the list. Now we've seen it in a lot of the areas, right? So if you go down to the coastal areas with like redwater, heartwater, a lot of the species can't survive there, like blessback, springback, they don't do really well. You might get lucky, and some of the blessback and springback develop an immunity to the ticks down there and they can combat these diseases, but they're not really from that area. And we can see that happening. But what does this mean to the ecosystems? What does this mean to the biodiversity? So, if we are going to bring the Cape lion back, what is it going to mean to our biodiversity? Has it changed from 1858 to when the last one left us to now? It must have, with having all these other species being introduced into our area for some weird reason, through wildlife, through management, through ecosystems, our biodiversity must have changed in some way. Oh, excuse me. So I keep asking myself all these questions, and while I'm completely for this model, I think it works for South Africa. I think game farming works. I want to see animals thrive no matter what province it is. I love the conservation efforts put behind them. I am fully aware of the game breeding aspect of it. I think there's a massive part in our industry for it. I think it's doing exceptionally well, not just financially, but also I think it's doing exceptionally well to revive a lot of our species in the area. So all these questions get asked and all of them get thrown at me. And a lot of the scenarios I look at and I'm like, maybe this whole approach, we can't reverse it. We're too far gone. We can't go back on what we started in 1960, the ownership of wild animals, and say to everyone, let's let them run free. You can't have black rhino running through the pubs in Shishlui anymore. You can't have the white rhino grazing along the fringes of the roads. It's never going to work. It's not going to work. Our ecosystem, our population, our country just doesn't allow it. So what does the future look like? Well, we've already established that a lot of these species have been intertwined in these provinces and brought in for financial gain, but also from a conservation point. I had an interesting podcast down. Yeah, I had an interesting podcast with Buffalo Kloof a couple of episodes ago, and the good work Warren Rippon's doing in that area just really shows the wonderful impact that individuals have by simply just caring for wildlife. It goes a very, very long way. And it shows the ethics behind biodiversity in that area, the ethics behind wildlife conservation, the ethics behind community enrichment, upliftment. And essentially, that's what this end goal should look like. We should be enriching people's lives, not with just financially, but knowledge, care, empathy, because we can learn a lot through what we've done as a human species to preserve what we have today. We damaged a lot back in the day, and we might be damaging a lot today. But our main goal has always stayed the focus point of our existence, and that is to preserve our wildlife. And in some cases, even bringing it back to life from all those years ago. Yes, maybe as humans we didn't have any sort of influence in the extinction of those species, but we're wanting to give it a second chance. We're wanting to bring it back to a world that is completely different to what they might have inherited as a genetically modified species. And I've been very fortunate to be able to watch this and watch how it grows, watch how different aspects of these individuals bring things to life. For instance, Buffalo Kloof was purely just a dream for Warren, I'm sure. And now to have black rhino, elephant, probably 4 out of the 5, big 5 on his property is something very, very special, something admirable to see. And then you got the conservation efforts of John X Safaris, who are ethically selecting old, mature animals to hunt ethically and make sure they represent the hunting industry on the ethical conservation side. And without these incredible individuals, none of this could ever exist, ever. There's too much conflict behind all of this. So, yeah, the list means nothing at the end of the day. It was just out of interest. It's more about us as humans trying to figure out the best way forward for our magnificent wildlife. And yeah. So, guys, that's it for this week's episode of the podcast. I don't know. I hope I did it justice. I'm running through some of the points I had here, and it doesn't seem like I've left anything out. Yeah, an interesting list to say the least. Whether you agree or disagree with it, I would love to know your guys' opinions. And as always, if you are, happy hunting. Until then, stay safe, stay blessed, stay humble. We'll catch up with you guys soon.